Okay, everyone. This is episode 5 of our series. Is Luke Acts written to win an appeal before Nero? And this is going to focus upon a remark that Luke makes in Acts 28, verse 11, on Castor and Pollux. And now this series, for those who are new here, it's about a book by John Mauck entitled Paul on Trial: The Book of Acts as a Defense of Christianity. And the contention of Mr. Mauck, a Christian attorney from Chicago, is that Luke and Acts were both addressed to Theophilus, the most excellent Theophilus, because he's a magistrate assistant to Nero. And therefore, we are trying to prepare for an appeal to be heard by Nero at Rome. And so if you realize when this book is being written, it is being written already after Luke is in Rome, and they're waiting for the trial to be upcoming. So all of what we're reading are recollections intended and meant for being conveyed to win a particular appeal that is waiting, and it will take about 2 more years to get all the witnesses there. And so Paul was taken by military officers on ships to bring him all the way to Rome, and they have succeeded in doing that. And so, we have reviewed already in 4 episodes. With one of them, there was multiple subparts. So there's really been quite a few, but this is episode 5, number 5 in the series technically. And we are going to focus on a remark in Acts 28, verse 11, and we'll show you what it's about and Mauck's contention of why it's valid. And I think this is, as he presents it, the strongest evidence in his entire, he has many pieces of evidence, but this single-handedly is impossible to really understand how Luke would mention this if it were not intended for pagans and not at all for Christians to read this particular line and how they would interpret it. So let's begin, and I hope you'll find this educational. And for those of you who are trying to figure out how to read the book of Acts, is this a eulogy, a book commending Paul to you, or is this a defense of Paul for purposes of a trial only or an appeal? And therefore, you have to understand it in that context, and then you will see this in a whole new light, and you'll realize this is not a book that is there to make Christians accept Paul. It is a book designed to make pagans accept Paul and extols certain things about Paul that only would only be viewed favorably by pagans. And so we've gone through that. This one is one simply, it's going to be about a remark that only pagans would care about. This really is conclusive that this book could not have been written for Christians, just on this particular verse alone. Okay, so we'll begin in a second. Okay, so we're going to take a look at Acts 28, verse 11, and what it's going to be talking about is sort of this image I'm presenting on screen to the left. It's going to be about these carvings or images on a ship of 2 gods or immortals in the pantheon of gods of both Rome and Greece, and they were known as Castor and Pollux. And this is the way it appears in your King James versus the NIV, and we'll talk about which one is correct. And then we're going to ask, why does Luke mention this at all? So in the King James, it reads, "And after 3 months, we departed in a ship of Alexandria." They're probably leaving from Malta. That's the inference. And it's a ship from Alexandria, Egypt. So it comes from Egypt all the way into Malta, which is in the Mediterranean, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. Sign was Castor and Pollux. Those are the twin gods we're talking about. New International Version. After 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had been wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods, Castor and Pollux. So the second one is a little more clear visually for us, that it's these images, and they could be at the front of the ship. They could be at the back of the ship. They actually could be at both ends of the ship. One would be on each end of the ship, more than likely. All right. So this is the underlying Greek words. And so it's the word parasemo, which was once thought to be the word for sign. Now it's believed to be, it's really for the word figurehead. And then the second word is diaskoroi, which is very clearly known as Castor and Pollux. And this is the image of what, if you were What would come to mind if you are Theophilus and Nero reading Acts as a legal brief? The images of at the Dioscuri or Castor and Pollux at Rome. So this is an image of them, and we'll also learn that there was a special temple in the Roman Forum for these two twins, and we'll see the interesting explanation. So this was a very important cult or religion within the Roman Empire, and it was at the center of their power at the Roman Forum that these two twins were revered, and it was very strong religious belief inside of the Roman Empire. So these are not obscure figures when Luke puts them into Acts 28, verse 11. I'm going to take a moment. Okay, so here's the story of Castor and Pollux that would be immediately recognized by Nero and by Theophilus. Now, what's interesting is they begin with one of the two is a son of God, a divine son of God, and that's Pollux, and he's a child of Zeus. But the other is Castor, which is his brother by another mother, but they share, by another father, but they are brothers, and so and they're twins. So it's just one of those mythologies, and so the son who is immortal and a god, he asks Zeus to let his immortality pass to be shared with his brother. So you can see this idea that you could almost imagine maybe Luke is mentioning it because it has a sort of parallel to Jesus. He's a son of God. He can pass his immortality with permission of Zeus to other brothers, with persons who are in affiliation with him. So it's not that far-fetched that this is why Luke is mentioning it, because it has some parallel to the idea that Jesus is the Son of God, and then he passes his immortality onto Christians. If you come from a pagan worldview, it would kind of prepare you to accept those type of truths. So anyway, that's what's in the article Castor and Pollux. If you looked at it at Wikipedia, you learn this particular background. And now what's also interesting is these two brothers, the Gemini, they're also called in Latin, is they grew up in Sparta, and Sparta was the home of where they came from. Now you have to know that the Spartans by this time, in the 1st century AD, have long been conquered. The Greeks are totally under the control of Rome. And that's a kind of an example of why in Roman religion, if you conquered a country, you can make their gods become your gods. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And also in the article Castor and Pollux at Wikipedia, it explains this. And in fact, these twins had been conquered much earlier. They were conquered in Greece, and then their deity was moved to the Roman Forum. So this is explained here. From the 5th century before the Christian era, the brothers were revered by Romans. So that's in the 400s BC, 400 years before Christ was even born. They are revered at Rome, probably as a result of a cultural transmission via the Greek colonies of Magna Graeca in southern Italy. An archaic Latin inscription of the 6th or 5th century before the Christian era found at Lavinium, which reads Castori Pollucoque Koroi to Castor and Pollux the Dioscoroi, suggests a direct transmission from the Greeks. All right. And the construction of the temple of Castor and Pollux, located in the Roman Forum, that's in the center of Rome next to the Colosseum today, at the heart of their city, was undertaken to fulfill a vow, a votum, made by Aulus Postumius Albus Regalensis in gratitude at the Roman victory in the Battle of Lake Regillus in 495 before the Christian era. So you can see these twins had a lot to do with the success of the Roman Empire when it was a fledgling military, a nation that had a strong military, and they were relying upon gods like these. So, and then this was, I thought, very interesting. It says the establishment of a temple may also be a form of avocario, the transferal of a tutelary deity from a defeated town to Rome, where the cult would be offered in exchange for favor. So, by conquering this deity, the country in which this deity lived, you could take their that deity, move it to your country, and somehow that gives you this greater power because you've now called on a defeated enemy and you've conquered their gods. So that's in the background of this. Is just gives you some more idea of how Romans believed adopting gods of other countries was a good idea because it promoted the feeling of conquest over that culture. You now controlled their gods. And so we shouldn't forget about that when you think about Constantine. By accepting or tolerating Christianity, was he really trying to just tolerate it and show latitude, or was he trying to, in a sense, conquer it? By conquering it, he could then conquer the God of the Christians, maybe even conquer the God of the Jews, and so on. So I just thought this would be useful for us to know a little bit more about Roman theology prior to Christianity, and that's would explain a lot about why Constantine is doing what he does too. But anyway, back to our story. Why would this detail of Castor and Pollux be in Acts 28, verse 11? And we'll move on to that issue. Okay, so I just want to show you about some of the scholarship in the background here before we get into Mr. Mauck's exposition on this. So if we go all the way back to 1834, the view of how to read that word in Greek would not be as the figurehead, the images of the gods on the front and back or on the front prow of the ship. This Cottage Bible, 1834, said it meant this word sign should mean the name of the vessel, which would generally be dedicated to some deity. But that is now no longer the idea. So as I show you Bible Hub here, parasemo is now understood to be with a figurehead. And this is also mentioned by the Cambridge Bible School for schools and colleges. They say by sign is meant what we now call figurehead, only that the ancient ships had such signs both at stem and stern, and often the figure was that of some divinity. Okay, so I think we now have a better idea of what this was talking about. And also there's more scholarship on it. And particularly, this ship was from Alexandria, it says in the verse 11, and Saint Cyril of Alexandria explained, this is sometime later I think this would be the 200s, tells us that it was always the Alexandrian method to ornament each side of the prow. So imagine the front end with the figure of deities, probably in the case Castor and Pollux, one on each side of the vessel. So it's kind of why I showed you this was at the beginning here. See this? So this would be they're twins, right? And so this is how someone imagined the wood carving from the 17th century. So this is the 1600s. Mr. Grinling created this as the prow of a ship. This may be exactly a fair representation of what we would see on the ship that Luke is getting on. And so why would he, so now it brings up the question, why would he mention this ship had the sign, the figureheads of Castor and Pollux? Why would he say that? That's really the bottom line question. So we're going to try to get to that in a second here. And okay, I'm going to take a break for a minute. Okay, so now this next quote from Meyer's commentary will prepare us to understand what Mr. Mauck is saying. He's saying something that's quite, seems at first very surprising about how he reads the passage. But when you read Meyer's New Testament commentary, then what Mr. Mauck's going to say makes more sense. So I put in quotes here what is in the text above that I cropped from the Bible Hub page. So if you look at the bottom there, this is how I would extract out of there the information that might help us understand Mr. Mauck's reasoning. So here it points out that Luke does not mention if the wrecked ship. Now there was a ship just before this passage that they had been on and got wrecked. And so they've had already a terrible problem, and this was a ship that was presumably protected by the Christian God at the time because there was no other God mentioned. Now we're going to be mentioning the gods of Castor and Pollux. Okay, so Luke does not mention if the wrecked ship had a deity sign. Okay, but you could argue, as I said, it could be the God of Israel, could have been that God. So it's not clear because, again, Paul talks about an angel at one point promising that somebody will die on the ship, and then later nobody dies, and then he says, an angel told me that no one would die. So there was some protection of the God of Israel in there, but not completely, because their ship got destroyed. But so here, by contrast, this time Luke's going to say who the gods are that protects this ship. So it says here, but Luke noticed, quote, Luke noticed the sign in this case, not in the other, meaning not in the case of the ship that sank. After the surmounted disaster, meaning the one that just happened, was the more alive, meaning Luke was more alive to such a special feature, meaning that the dual Castor and Pollux on the prow, probably, of the ship in which they now embarked. So that you may not see the implication of this, but Mr. Mauck does. And I'm going to tell you what he's going to say, and you'll see in a second. He believes that this is showing a contrast, that if you were a pagan reading this, you would conclude that the God of Israel, who knew someone would die at first, then said, no, nobody's going to die, but the ship gets destroyed anyway. That's the God of Israel, and they ended up losing the ship. Oh boy. Now Luke is saying that Castor and Pollux are the gods protecting this ship. And when he's writing this, he's already landed in Rome. So this is the destination where they're heading from apparently Malta. They're going directly to Rome, and this has already been successful. So what would you conclude if you're a pagan? Castor and Pollux, that our gods here at the Roman Forum, they're protecting him. Okay, we get it. So that's what Mr. Mack's going to say, and he's going to make a good point about that. We'll get into it, but basically, why would this be in a book intended for Christians? Or is it more likely this book is intended only for pagan judges, the magistrate Theophilus and Nero, the ultimate appellate trier of the appeal? The appeal is going to be a kind of another trial. So Nero is that officer. And so he's going to be influenced by the fact that there's some God protecting Paul and got him here to Rome. So let's now look at these points they're being made at page 180 of Mr. Mack's book, Paul on Trial, from 2001, citing Acts 28:11. I'm going to read this. In this transition paragraph summarizing a journey of about 2 weeks from Malta to Rome, Luke gives the reader fascinating details. They sailed on an Alexandrian, meaning an Egyptian ship, quote, with the twin gods Castor and Pollux. If Acts is written to acquaint the Roman hierarchy with the Jewishness of faith in Jesus and to defend Paul against the accusers, what conceivable purpose does Luke have in including this detail? Of course, the same question must be asked if one assumes Acts was written to Christians. So ask yourself, why would Luke include Castor and Pollux are the guardians of this ship, in essence, when Christians would not respect that? These are pagan gods. We don't worship pagan gods. We're coming from a Jewish background, or we're interested in Jewish religion. We don't believe in paganism. We believe there's one God. We're monotheistic, and so on. This would be not intended for Christians, but it would be very appealing to Nero and to Theophilus as pagans to hear this detail. So let's continue and see what Mr. Mauck says precisely. If anything, the Castor and Pollux details and the uneventful sail from Malta to Rhegium to Puteoli, meaning they made it all the way to the Roman ports, when juxtaposed with the preceding catastrophic storm and shipwreck, implied that the protection of the pagan gods was superior to that of the God of Israel. So that's what I was trying to set up, that you would understand. That's his point. What would you conclude as a Roman person who knows they've made it all the way to Puteoli? They've landed in our ports. They're here in Rome. They're safe and sound. Castor and Pollux did a better job than the God of Israel. They almost all died, and that included one of the Roman officers, but he lived. So anyway, that's page 181. And then he has this interesting quote of Brian Rapsky. So there's Christians who've commented on this, and he's looking at what they're saying. So let's hear what he's sharing with us. Brian Rapsky notes that D. Ladouceur suggests that the function of the particular gods, quote, the guardians of truth and the punishment of perjurers. So apparently this these gods are known as guardians of truth and the punisher of perjurers, may be set forth as, quote, one more argument in a sequence calculated to persuade the reader of Paul's innocence. But why would, so these people, he's saying, Brian Rapsky realizes these type of statements are designed to make the reader conclude Paul is innocent in a matter that is pending on appeal when this book ends. Who does Luke, who is Luke then appealing to? Christians aren't making a determination whether he's innocent or guilty. None of these issues, are presented for our resolution. But if this is presented as a brief to the pagans, this is definitely what's pending at the time the book of Acts is concluded. There's an appeal to Caesar that Paul made in front of Festus, and that's why the Roman officers are taking him to Rome to be tried under an appeal to Nero Caesar. Okay, so he then continues. This is not a detail, the twin Roman gods, which Luke would include to persuade messianics of the truth of Paul's defense. So that's right. It's clearly not meant for Christians, right? It just doesn't persuade us at all to see him in a better light at all. Rather, it is a coincidence, and I don't know what he means by that, but regardless, it is a coincidence which would be immediately appreciated by a pagan Roman jurist without explanation by Luke. What I think he's trying to say is, if they made it safely here, it's a, quote, coincidence that they're safe and sound, versus when they were under the God of Israel, they got almost killed. I think that's what he's trying to say. It's a kind of a just a humorous remark there. But Luke doesn't even have to explain it to the pagans because they understand immediately who Castor and Pollux are. It's just us Christians, we don't understand who these two people are, or why would it matter? There's a sign of Castor and Pollux. Doesn't make any sense to us. In addition to the forensic reinforcement from the Castor Pollux detail, Luke may be evangelizing again. Just as Paul used the unknown God in Athens to point Greek intellectuals to Jesus, Luke appears to be using Castor and Pollux to point polytheistic Romans to Paul as the messenger of God's truth. Well, again, I don't think that pops out at here at all. I mean, it doesn't tell us that Paul is well, okay. Maybe what he's meaning is Castor and Pollux want to protect Paul. That's maybe what it is. And so therefore Paul is an agent of their own gods, Castor and Pollux, protecting Paul, while even the God of Israel didn't do that good a job protecting Paul when it went into they had the storm and the ship was destroyed, and many, objects were lost in the ocean. And that was a bad thing. But now with Castor and Pollux in charge, got a smooth sailing ship to Rome from Malta. So that's maybe what he means, and that's showing some sort of protection of the pagan gods over Paul. Anyway, clearly not meant for Christians, and that makes his case very strong. And here's how he puts it in the charts. He has lots of items in the chart, so when you strip out all the others, item number 58 is the issue he's talking about. So I've stripped out all the others and just shown you his chart title and his chart number 58. And the defense is, and now, before we read the defense, look in the middle there. Charge being defended. You really have to know what he means. It has to bear on one of these two issues. So he's claiming that the main two charges against Paul is he's offering an illegal new religion. And again, if that's true, then Christianity can be outlawed. So he's saying that's a main issue here. So Christianity doesn't want to be outlawed, and that's why Luke has been engaged by the main church, not by Paul, but by the main church. And that's why they've cooperated with him to have the Hebrew Matthew translated by him, and that's what creates the Luke gospel. And then Acts, which means they have to cooperate with him as well, do interviews and all kinds of things to create those narratives that we're reading. Okay, so that's why they're cooperating, and that's why this brief is being written in the first place, on behalf of the main church. But it also benefits Paul, and both sides now have a self-interest. Christianity has a self-interest. Paul has a self-interest. If he's teaching an illegal new religion, he could be criminalized, and everything he did, all the trouble he's caused, he could be punished. And also the church would lose its legal favor or legal sanction under Roman law. We'd be a religio illicit, and we would be outlawed. And also he was alleged to have incited civil unrest. So these are the primary two charges as he sees it. I see there's more charges, but he doesn't. That's neither here nor there. So now let's take what he's talking about, Acts 28:11, and he says it fits in the defense on the left column. Paul's God has even caused the Roman gods to attest to Paul's innocence. So how's that going to happen? So he cites the proof on the right side, Acts 28:11. The Roman gods of truth and perjury convey Paul to Rome. So the successful, safe trip just by itself of these two gods have conveyed the message that these two very important Roman gods, mortals, Gemini in the constellation, are protectors of Paul, and therefore he is not bringing an illegal new religion. He is not inciting civil unrest, and Paul's God therefore has even caused the Roman gods to test Paul's innocence. So these Roman gods are going along with the God of Israel, but the God of Israel is not even as strong and as powerful as these gods. Is what he also suggested, is that would be a natural conclusion of Nero and Theophilus. Okay, so anyway, getting back to the real point here is Mauck making a good case that the book of Acts is written primarily for pagan Theophilus and a pagan Nero to win an appeal, so we are not outlawed as an illegal new religion, or that we're a religion that's creating civil unrest against the Jewish people, and therefore we're disturbers of the peace and we need to be punished. And the answer is very clear, that that's exactly what this whole book is about. And it was never intended for Christians to be reading for any kind of edification purposes or to make any positive conclusions about Paul, of which there's numerous pieces of evidence in here that the kind of proof that Luke is using is counterproductive for Paul's validity. And I'm just going to repeat one or two of them, which is in Acts 17, verse 21, Paul says God does not live in human hands. He's saying this to Stoic human hands. He does not live in temples made of human hands. When we all know as Christians that God did at that time live in the temple of Jerusalem, and did so for another 10 years from the date he said it in the Mars Hill speech. And God did dwell at the temple made of human hands. And Jesus even refers to that temple in Mark as a temple made of human hands. So the very same words, Paul and Jesus directly conflict. It's hard to believe that Luke doesn't know that. And then I guess I'll leave it there. That's all we need to know. There's no way that Christians could just extract from that any defense of Paul's mistake or whatever. But he's completely contradicting Jesus. So Luke is not here trying to prove Jesus and Paul harmonize. He's trying to get us off on a trial. Paul makes a statement that's a mistake biblically, but it's a very positive thing, because the pagans do not believe their gods live in temples made of human hands. They live, this is weird, because they do make temples of human hands, but they don't live there. In the pagan religion, they all live in where? Mount Olympus. And they don't actually reside in the temple. So you, in off hours, when there's no sacrifice going on, they're not there. You can't sit there around and make novenas to their gods. That's not how pagan religion worked. You had to have a sacrifice, and when you did that, the pagans would show up for the dinner. The pagan gods would theoretically be present to participate and enjoy the meal with you, and you'd invoke their names. But once you were done with the meal, they're gone. And that's how they work. So Paul's statement that God does not live in temples made of human hands perfectly suits pagan religion, although it's completely contradictory of the Judaic religion, the religion of the Bible. Okay, everybody, I hope that helps you make your own assessment that Luke is indeed not writing for us. It's never intended to be something that Christians would read and conclude that Paul is a valid person for us to accept as an apostle of Jesus Christ, because, of course, he's contradicting Jesus Christ right there in Acts 17:17 and a whole bunch of other things like that. Okay. And so when you are talking to your friends who believe otherwise and think that Paul is being extolled here in Acts, tell them a few of these things and remind them about Castor and Pollux, because why in the world would Luke ever mention pagan gods are protecting the ship? That's just simply what he's saying. He says, and its sign, its figurehead was Castor and Pollux. No reason to mention it except to appeal to a pagan judge, Nero, and a pagan magistrate judge who's helping Nero, Theophilus. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Good night. Ciao. Bye.